Hello and welcome back to biology. So today we want to talk about acquiring nutrients. Now we have talked about what it is that organisms do in order to capture energy, acquire energy, store energy, and then release that energy. But a really key part of what's going on is the actual stuff that's involved. And what we're really talking about here are nutrients. So what else is it that organisms need? Now, the first question that I want to ask you for your mini quiz is, which best describes an ecosystem? It must contain consumers but can exist without producers. It can exist with or without a constant source of energy input. It involves interactions between biotic and abiotic factors. It can exist on land but not in lakes, rivers, or oceans. Well, we know that our primary producers are autotrophs, and they are the base of all of the ecosystems. So you can't really have something that consumes if it doesn't have something to consume. Okay, you can't have anything if you don't have a constant supply of energy. So that's right out, right? You have the organisms interacting with all of the things, their environment around them. That is an ecosystem. A combination, well, not a combination, but an interaction between biotic and abiotic factors. So 3 is the answer. And 4 is definitely not the answer because you have aquatic ecosystems. And not everything is terrestrial. So there are ecosystems in lakes, rivers, oceans. There's ecosystems in ice at the poles, actually. So when we say biotic, we're talking about the living parts. That's the plants, animals, microbes, whatever. Abiotic, that's all the other stuff. So the temperature, rainfall, wind, gravity, elevation, light intensity, humidity, soil, air, water, that kind of stuff. Okay. Now here's the thing. The abiotics are going to dictate what kind of biotics you are going to have in your environment. But in turn, the biotics help shape the environment that they are in. And so it's this constant exchange, okay? And boundaries between ecosystems are unclear, right? And one ecosystem may in fact be a part of a larger ecosystem, okay? Or biome even. And so you have these systems within systems. But the first thing that we want to talk about that is a necessity is water, okay? After energy, water is the next big deal. And water is necessary for all living organisms. It's used in metabolic processes. We know that we had to have CO2 and water in order to do photosynthesis, but also cells require a moist environment. Remember, gas exchange has to be in moist surfaces, and so cells actually have to be moist. They have water inside of them, okay? And so everything needs water, right? In the big picture, water flowing through the ecosystem, it can bring nutrient-rich sediments. It can flush out bad stuff like pollutants. It can bring in all kinds of new life, right? Because microbes and all kinds of stuff comes with it, if not, larger organisms. So all kinds of stuff there. And water actually cycles through the living things and the abiotic components, right? And that, of course, is called the water cycle. You should be familiar with the water cycle. I've just put a couple of things in here, and then I've put a nice little picture there. Make sure that you know terms like percolation. Infiltration is where water comes into the soil. Percolation is where it's flowing. Evaporation and transpiration. I know you know what evaporation means, but transpiration is the release of water from plants. And the process of water evaporating off of plant leaves is called evapotranspiration. So those are some extra terms that you might not have heard before that I do want you to know. Okay, now moving on to the other stuff, right? There are about 15 elements that are going to make up the bulk of living mass, okay? And they circulate through. You need more of some of them than others, okay? And so the ones that you need the most of, or they're in most molecules, are going to be these guys: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. You do need to know them, but an easy way to remember that is NCHOPS. That's how I like to remember them, NCHOPS. Those are also going to be the things that are the big cycles, the big biogeochemical cycles, and I'll say what that means in just a second. But these are the ones we're going to be concentrating on. All of the rest of them you do need, but it may be for smaller things or processes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hierarchy. When we talk about living systems, there's a hierarchy of levels. Okay, so we start out with atoms. atoms combine to form molecules. Those molecules combine to form bigger molecules called macromolecules, and we will be talking all about those on a different day. Macromolecules build cells. Cells build organs, organ systems, and, well, tissues, organs, organ systems, and then organisms. An organism is an individual. Lots of individuals of the same type that will interbreed in the wild are species, and a population is a group of the same species that actually is interbreeding and interacting together. And then from there, you go to community. A community is a bunch of populations, right? Different species. And then communities acting with the abiotic factors, that's an ecosystem. And all the ecosystems that are alike, those are biomes, and biomes make up the biosphere. Okay, now, one of the cool things about living systems is that there are macromolecules that are unique to these living organisms. The nucleic acids, which make up DNA, RNA, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. And like I said, we're going to be talking about those a lot later on. So, moving on to nutrition and the nutrients that animals need. Nutrition, when we talk about nutrition, that is acquiring nutrients and processing them and, how you get them, what they are. When you talk about nutrition, you basically are kind of talking about 5 categories: the lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, minerals, and vitamins. And you take those in, and then we break them down, and we build the stuff we need with those, or we use them in processes, things like that. So, cellular metabolism, any of that. Minerals and vitamins are the things that you're going to need the least of. Lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins are going to be the bulk of your diet. Okay, so when you acquire nutrients, you've got the nutrients. Those can be, and you're talking about you in particular. We digest and absorb them and break them down into things. So you've got glucose, amino acids, fats, right? Amino acids build proteins. Glucose is a sugar. Those build carbohydrates, right? And so those get distributed around the body. They are precursors to building things. They may be fuel, right? They may be catalysts, whatever. And then we're going to build macromolecules. We're going to use energy, store energy, and we're going to get some sort of end product that is useful. Okay, so nutrient terminology: macronutrient, this is what we need a lot of. Micronutrients, it's what we need a little of. And then essential nutrients are things that we need, but we can't actually make. You eat them in your diet. You get them in your diet. Okay. So what does a self-sustaining ecosystem actually need? Does it need greater number of herbivores than producers? Cycling of materials between organisms and their environments, constant temperature, or soil that is acidic? Okay, so we see that constant temperature thing again. No, you do not need a constant temperature here. Okay, and also some ecosystems do need soil that's acidic for the plants that live there. If the soil is not acidic, something else lives there. But that's not something that an ecosystem needs, right? And let's look at this greater number of herbivores. Herbivores eat plants. That would be producers. If you have more plant eaters than plants, that's not going to be very self-sustaining for very long, is it? So what we need in order for an ecosystem to work is for materials to cycle between the abiotic and the biotics, the organisms in their environment. So biotic and abiotic there. Okay. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the ecosystem in terms of 4 different compartments. There's the organic compartment, and that is the living organisms and their detritus, which is, parts and waste and stuff. The available nutrient compartment, typically that is what is going to be held onto the surface of soil particles, or it's in solution in water and can be taken up by plants through their roots. Okay. Some of those things are actually going to be in the air, which is that 4th compartment, right? Available air. So some nutrients are in the air. And then the third compartment on the list is a compartment we're really not going to talk about very much at all because it's not very helpful. These are all the nutrients that are locked up in soil or rock, and organisms just can't get to those, right? So when we talk about uptake of inorganic nutrients, most of this is going to occur through the soil. The majority of these things are coming in through the soil. Now, CO2 and O2 will enter through the leaves of plants, but everything else is going to come in through the soil or water, right? If you're talking about something that's aquatic, it's going to come in through the roots in the water, okay? Now, consumers, on the other hand, are going to obtain their nutrients from producers, even though you can get some minerals other ways, like animals will go off to salt licks and they'll lick salt deposits, or they'll get some vitamins and minerals through water consumption. Most of the nutrients come from diet. Okay, now nutrient cycles. The pathways that all of these elements take going through the ecosystem is called a biogeochemical cycle because it's involving all three of those arenas, right? Okay, here's just a nice little kind of picture. We're talking about organic available nutrients. They can get locked up into all kinds of things through fossilization. Coal, oil, and peat is a really good example of that. We can release these unavailable things. This is more of a human activity, this release. We're talking about burning fossil fuels. That can get everything in, that can get a lot of this organic stuff available again, or inorganic actually. CO2, for instance, comes from burning. That's not important. That's not what we're talking about in this class. But what we want to focus on are these two areas, okay? The organic materials and the inorganic materials. So this is organic material that is fossilized. This is inorganic material that is locked up in sedimentary rock, right? So we care about the blue and the green sections. Okay, now, right, this is just a nice picture of a general nutrient cycle, a biogeochemical cycle. The first cycles we want to talk about, now we've already talked about the water cycle. The hydrologic cycle, water cycle, is one of the 5 biogeochemical cycles. And so we're going to kind of talk about that separately, but then hydrogen and oxygen come in another cycle, and that is the carbon cycle, right? So what you're looking at here is the carbon cycle. It is photosynthesis and respiration, basically, is what we're talking about, okay? And so we've already talked about that. Nitrogen cycle is the next one we want to talk about. Nitrogen is key. You need lots and lots of nitrogen, all right? And that's great because there's lots and lots of it in the atmosphere. However, atmospheric nitrogen, N2, is not available for plants to take up. It has to be converted. And so everything that's happening in the nitrogen cycle is going to be facilitated by bacteria. And it is the bacteria that will take that into and convert it into something useful. Now, I am not expecting you to know all of the steps of the nitrogen cycle or any of these, sulfur cycle or phosphorus cycle. I do want you to understand photosynthesis and respiration as part of the carbon cycle, but otherwise we're looking at the overall kind of thing. Now, I do want you to know that these inorganics can only be taken up in certain forms. In the case of nitrogen, it is going to be nitrate and ammonium, and to get those, bacteria, different species of bacteria, do different things, okay? Now, here is just another kind of version of the nitrogen cycle, and this adds in the human component. And all of the cycles have an addition of a human component, but I liked this picture because I think it really illustrates how much we change, and we significantly change the nitrogen cycle. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay. Why do you need nitrogen? It is an essential component of amino acids and proteins, organic molecules, carbohydrates, sugars, glucose, the hydrologic cycle. Well, you can cross the hydrologic cycle right off because that would be water. Carbohydrates and sugars, well, sugar is a carbohydrate, so there you go. Organic molecules, this is important. The definition of the organic molecule is that it has carbon and hydrogen in it, right? It doesn't have to have anything else. The simplest organic molecule is going to be methane, CH4. You don't have to have anything other than that to be considered organic. So nitrogen, though, is the key to the amino acids, and amino acids build proteins, and proteins do all kinds of things in your body that we are going to talk about later on. Okay, let's move on to the phosphorus cycle. You need lots of phosphorus because what about all that ATP, right? That P in the ATP is phosphate, well, phosphorus. The other thing is that phosphate is the backbone of DNA, and we'll talk about that later on too. The interesting thing about the phosphorus cycle that makes it different, now the nitrogen cycle, its key, its uniqueness, if you will, is that it's all facilitated by bacteria, okay? The phosphorus cycle is that unique thing is that it's never in the atmosphere. It's either in rocks, dissolved in water, or in organic stuff, right? And that's where you find it. Now, the sulfur cycle, you also need sulfur for multiple processes. It's in functional groups, stuff like that. And sulfur is kind of this also basic cycle, and we're not going to go over it a whole lot. We're really going to focus more on carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, and water, okay? But I wanted you to be aware that there is this lovely sulfur cycle here, okay? Now, I want to call your attention to this really cool experiment that was actually done. This is actually done, okay? It's in the Hubbard Brook Forest in New Hampshire. But people started asking, what about nutrients? How are they in the soil, and what facilitates good nutrient-rich soil? Okay, and so people started thinking about, well, what keeps soil on hillsides? Trees. Trees keep soil on hillsides. So if there are no trees, does that mean that nutrients are also removed from soil? And so the question that they asked was, how does the presence of vegetation affect the rate of nutrient export in an ecosystem? And it turned out, right, that they actually deforested part of this area, and then they had an area that was still forested, and they had kind of different things there. But you have this 38-acre watershed, and you can see here there's erosion lines, there's leaching, there's all kinds of stuff. Then you have this nice rich area over here. And so vegetation, plants, actually turn out to be really important to these biogeochemical cycles because they help hold nutrients in the soil and keep them available for plants. And that's kind of a cool thing. But when you start talking about nutrients in living things, in some ways you can think of that as being a little bit locked up. I mean, if you don't eat something, it just dies. So how do the nutrients become available, right? Do they come available through decomposers like bacteria, mold, and mushrooms, dead things and waste that are broken down into organic materials, or nutrient recycling, or all of these? Nutrients become available in all of these ways. The thing we want to focus on now, though, as we've talked about, things dissolve and get into water, so nutrients can dissolve from rocks and get into water and all this good stuff. But once they're in living things, you're going to need something to release them, and that is going to be your decomposers, right? Decomposition is the breakdown of organic materials into simpler compounds, and the organisms that do this are called saprotrophic, okay? And so you've got saprotrophic or saprophytic, that's either way, or organisms are going to break down these complex carbon-containing organic molecules into simple molecules through the action of enzymes, right? Hydrolytic enzymes. And we're going to talk about enzymes later on. But all of this is really an important thing. And so what you're going to do, actually, is you're going to bring something in, and we're going to let it decompose and see what happens to it. Yeah? Okay. Now, your last question is this. Trees in the tropical rainforest have blank root systems because. Do they have deep root systems because water near the soil surface is too acidic for the trees? Do they have shallow root systems because nutrients occur in the shallow surface layer because that's where everything's decaying? Do they have deep root systems because a large percentage of soil nutrients lie at great depths because they've been flushed there by rains? Shallow because there's intense competition for moisture and it only occurs at the surface because rapid evaporation prevents water from penetrating deep into the soil. What you're going to do in this question is take all of the stuff that we've talked about in this lecture and figure out what makes the most sense given a tropical rainforest. The answer is that tropical rainforests actually have really shallow roots. They have really poor soils, if you think about it. When rainforests are cut down, it's very hard to grow new things after a couple of years because all the nutrients from the decaying trees are used up, right? And in the rainforest, things decay really, really rapidly because hot, like warm and moist grow bacteria, and bacteria lots of decomposers, right? And so things decompose really rapidly, but they're taken up really rapidly too. So if you see a root system and you see it's really shallow, that means you're going to have high rates of decomposition. And I think that's a very interesting thing, and it'll tie into some of our conversations later on. And that is it for nutrients. If you have any questions, please ask me in class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.